Thank you, Torsten. And thank you very much from all of us, the three of us, but also in a sense, the entire community of sometimes what people call the randomistas, who we represent and whose work, in a sense, we build on and benefit from. From all of them to the Nobel Committee and the Nobel Foundation for this great honor, to our friends and family that have come from all over the world for just being willing to be with us at this moment and cheering for us, and to all of you who have come to listen to me. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about, as Torsten said, about the field experiments and the practice of economics. Field experiments, sometimes I'm going to use the word RCT for them. In fact, predominantly RCTs are randomized controlled trials, and the idea of them is to look at interventions through the comparison of random treatment and control groups, people who are randomly chosen to get an intervention and people who are randomly chosen not to get an intervention, to compare them to know whether what impact that intervention had. This is a very simple idea borrowed from the medical sciences, but one which has its own implementations in the social sciences. In just the community of JPAL, which is our organization, the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, there's about 1,000 of these that have now happened. And what I'm going to speak about is not just our work, but in a sense, a little bit of the gleanings from many works of many of those people in that 1,000-person group. And the next talk by Esther and even the talk by Michael will, in a sense, echo very similar themes. And between them, hope we'll give you a sense of where and why the work we've done has been different and possibly important. I'm going to make the claim that RCTs, as I said, were these field experiments, have changed economics. And I think they've changed economics in two different ways. One, by changing the day-to-day practice of economics, what we do when we have to answer a question, but also by changing the questions we ask, very different questions. And in a sense, maybe the more profound impact has been that we now think in terms of very different questions, and even the ways we think of what the answers could be are different. And that's maybe the point that is most salient, and I'll try to underscore that as I go through this lecture. In the process, just to make this conversation with economics a bit more salient, I'm going to slightly caricature the practice of economics, because in some ways to explain it in the most nuanced way would take longer than I have. Hopefully you'll forgive me for the caricature. So I think and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up as a debate between economics and RCTs. This is not, when I first started doing RCTs, people would say, that's not uninteresting, but is it economics? And I always sort of struggle to say, what is economics? But I think economics is these things that are meant to be claims, which you may or may not always recognize. But I think those claims are posited against what RCTs do. So I'm going to try to set up that caricature and then maybe respond to the caricature. So the first general claim that's sometimes made is RCTs are about, you testing the effect of an intervention. You're saying whether changing a particular way of teaching in a school is good or bad. You're not answering generalizable questions. You're not telling us generalizable truths. And that's a claim that is often made. It comes out of a sense that, of course, generalizable truths are what we want. And of course, people who do our cities are not entirely stupid, so they also want to have generalizable truths. But we go about it slightly differently. Economics has a specific way of looking for them, which requires, so economics starts with an idea that what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to use the data that we have to infer the deep truths about human behavior. And from those, we will tell you, we'll build a model which will be premised on all these assumptions about human behavior that we're going to make. And from that, we're going to then say, well, the people must have been behaving in this way in order to observe what the data we observe. Once we have that, then we can build from that story, a model, which would then predict what's going to happen in many circumstances. So it's generalizable through the lens of human behavior. We're going to infer fundamentals about human behavior, and then from that go to generalizability. That requires often having a pretty specific view of human behavior about, people wanting mostly money, and people and how markets work. Usually markets will have to work well. So all of those kind of premises then add up to a prediction. What our cities do is say, let's just start from an idea and let's try it in a few places, and then work backwards towards seeing whether we believe that what the city is telling us is actually a generalizable truth, or just something that happens to have happened in one or two places. And I want to give you an example of why these two ways of thinking give you quite different answers. And so these starting from fundamental premises of behavior is in an important and crucial way different from starting from empirical observations and then inferring behavior from those. So here is an example which I'm going to take from a field which gave me my first foothold in economics, the field of what is called social learning, the idea that people learn from each other, and that has a particular pattern and a specificity to it. This is, of course, very important in many contexts. If you want to spread a message, you have a serious disease, an infection going on, and you want to contain it. How do you do it? You plant messages about what to do and what not to do. You tell certain people, and you need to know who to tell, and maybe how to tell them as well. So the question of who to tell has a specific answer within economic theory. Economic theory does answer that question. Once you have, as I said, a model of human behavior, you can use it to make a prediction. And the prediction is typically that you should look for people who are central to a network, people who are connected to connected people. That's the idea that's typically implied by economic models, and it's an idea that you could use. You could go and find those people and tell them, this is the message, please pass it on. Now those people, of course, have to be found, so you have to know something about the nature of the network. That's sometimes difficult. You need to know who's connected to whom. A very much more empiricist way to go about it, but inspired by maybe a more informal way of theorizing the world, is the idea that you could just ask the members of the social network. You could say, instead of saying, what is the network and then who's central, let's go to the people and ask them, who do you think would be great in spreading a message? So if you ask people that question, what is striking is people give you quite often the same answer. So when you ask them, they say Abhijit. Who is Abhijit? Abhijit is a gossip. So the idea of a gossip, of course, doesn't actually exist in economic theory. It's not an idea that we have any handle on, but it's an idea that people know. They'll tell you who the gossip is, and we could try that. We could seed the gossips. We could tell the gossips what the message is, and we could see where that goes. And if that works, we could try it again, and we could could try to learn about that. This is effectively what we did. We did this in 2 experiments, one in the south of India, in Karnataka, where this was for kind of a trivial application. It was for cell phone raffles. We seeded the gossips, we seeded random people, and we seeded important people. And neither random people nor important people do particularly well. Gossips do spectacularly. Gossips are 3 times as good as everybody else in reaching people. Then the reaction to that was, well, maybe cell phone raffles are irrelevant because, who cares about them? So we tried to do the same thing about vaccination. And again, we ran a race between randomly choosing to seed gossips versus randomly choosing to seed trusted people or random people. So, again, running a race, and it's an experiment. We ran in randomly chosen villages, we seed the gossip, randomly chosen villages, we seed trusted people or random people. And when we do that, we find that gossips lead to twice as many kids being vaccinated. So those are enormously consequential results. And what I want to emphasize here is not so much a policy point, but that economic theory would have only got us part of the way there. Why? Because the gossips are indeed central in the network. That's part of the reason why they are good spreaders, because they are central in the network. They're well connected, but they're also much chattier than everybody else. They're just conditional on how central they are. They're much better at spreading the message because they're gossips. They love talking. They go to other people and tell them, "Do you know what I heard?" And that idea is simply very hard to get at from the economic theory. The economic theory emphasizes many things, but it doesn't emphasize people's desire to go and share ideas, because there's no benefit to that other than the benefit of sharing. And so the word gossip really doesn't arise in economics. And if we started from a model, we would have never got to the idea of a gossip. And in some sense, the point I'm making, coming back to a generalization, what generalizes from this is a word that would not come out of the economic model. This is the idea of a gossip. The idea of gossip is what is the primary generalized lesson from this experiment. And now we kind of know that gossips are useful. In that sense, I think one of the ways in life our cities are important is they liberate us from using the categories that are dictated by the word economics. So economics is somehow a way of, people are motivated by certain specific things. In a sense, these people were not motivated by those things, or at least that was not what's important, and that this was where our cities helped us. The second criticism of our cities is often that our cities are after small interventions. Economics is about big ideas, big growth, instability, capitalism, socialism, all kinds of big stuff. Yeah, maybe. I agree that economics could be about these things. I am less convinced that economics is very much useful to say about these things, other than let's say, let's not do what Venezuela or North Korea does. I don't know that we have so much to say about how to stop instability. So I'm less convinced, not about the fact that the question is important, but that we, the contrast of saying we are just solving these big problems, well, maybe, and you are doing all the small stuff, that seems to me a little bit of a caricature. But also, let me argue that we actually are after big stuff. So here's a question. One of the basic propositions in economics, again starting from that model, is that making people richer makes them lazier. That's because people love to slack, and having the pressure off, economic pressure off, makes them lazy. Well, how many rich and lazy people do you know? I'll let you think about that. In fact, this is critical because it's a big part of the case against being too generous with poor people. You shouldn't give them too much easy slack, because then they'll become lazy. So you should not, give them money, because that makes them lazy. So we did actually, one of the nice things about our cities is this is work we did with Rima Hanna and Ben Olken and Gabriel Kreinler. This is about looking at the there were a bunch of our cities where people were given money, and then we looked at what happened to whether they became lazy or not. And while you may want to read what's written in the fine print, the main point is that the two colored bars are identical. Statistically, they're not different, and people don't become lazier when you give them money. There's no evidence that they become lazier. At least poor people don't become lazier when they get money. So that suggests that maybe we shouldn't be so mistrustful of the poor. Maybe we could be a bit more generous to them. So here's an intervention we also studied, which was asking the question, can we be more generous with the poor? Would that be just make them lazy and give up, or would that actually be good for them? This is the study of BRAC's graduation program. BRAC is an NGO in Bangladesh, one of the great NGOs of the world, and they had a program targeted to the poorest of the poor. The poorest of the poor were given a package of some assets, some training, some hand-holding, some temporary cash assistance, all of those. There was RCTs in 7 countries, and there was a durable impact. Durable meaning, I'll tell you, 10 years later, we find that the incomes of the people who were given the assets are higher, so there was no evidence they became richer. They own more assets, they work longer, they're not lazier, they work longer, they earn more, they're happier, healthier. After 10 years, they are about, in India, where we follow them for 10 years, their consumption per head is about 30% higher, income is 30% higher. That was about what it was all along, similar results. And indeed, for income, we find that between the 3rd and the 7th year, the impact actually grows. So they actually become, rather than falling back towards poverty, they become more and more dynamic and move away from the others. So that's a sense in which and this is similar results from Bangladesh. Now, that made us ask this question, why is it that this happens? Why? And that goes to one of the fundamental questions, going back to this question of big and small questions. Why are some people so small? And there are really 2 theories. One is that they're born that way. That's, they are somehow not able to stay rich. They spend all their money, they're lazy, they are irresponsible. In that case, if you gave them something, it will go away. The alternative is that they were poor because they are poor, meaning all their parents were poor. They didn't have an opportunity, and if they didn't have an opportunity, there was nothing they could do to get out of there. This was an idea that has been studied for many years. This is the idea of a poverty trap, and it's in fact work that I think got me into being a development economist. 1 minute, 20 seconds of an anecdote about my life. I started, as Torsten said, as a theorist. I wrote a theory paper about, poverty traps, and it had the word development in it. So on the strength of that, and having no training and no experience of teaching development, I was offered a job of teaching development at Harvard, and that then led to RCTs and all those other things that I eventually learned, mostly from my students and colleagues. So that's a way in which my life, like the lives of the people I'm describing, a small accident has durable effects. So this is a very nice piece of work, understanding what's going on. Why are these people? How do they manage to stay durably rich? I told you that when you give them the asset, they stay durably rich. How does that happen? And this was studied carefully in this very nice piece of work by Claire Balboni, Oriana Bandeira, Robin Burgess, Moitish Ghotok, and Anton Heil. And the point here was to just look at what happens from year to year among people who have a certain level of wealth today. How does their wealth grow? And the point for wealth to be, if a little bit more wealth leads to a lot more wealth tomorrow, then you could imagine people taking off. So a little bit more wealth today leads to a lot more wealth tomorrow, which leads to even more wealth tomorrow, day after, etc. If you have the opposite, so that people, a little more wealth tomorrow tomorrow generates only a small amount wealth, extra wealth, then that's going to slow down and you'll fall back. The first picture represents the case where people basically can't escape. They're trapped in poverty because there's no escape, because essentially if you give me a little more, maybe I'll eat half of it tomorrow and half of it day after, and then it'll be gone. The other case is where the relationship between wealth today and wealth tomorrow looks like this, an S shape. And in this case, the key idea is that you see that yellow curve suddenly becoming very steep. What that's saying is that a small amount of wealth today actually increases wealth. $1 today gives you $1.50 tomorrow. And therefore, that gives you $2.25 day after, and so on. And that becomes self-sustaining. And to look at which of these curves apply, they actually looked at the data from Bangladesh, from this asset transfer experiment, and they find that this is what it looks like. You can see that the curve looks like an S, like the curve I showed you. And in a sense, what they're demonstrating is that you can actually not only claim that people are just poor because they're poor, and if you give them a push, they'll keep going, but also that you can show that that's in fact the transition. So you can look at that. And this means that essentially people are going to be either sort of just too poor to make it, and then they'll become poorer and poorer, and you see the hump on the left, or they'll become richer and richer, and then you see the hump on the left. The middle will empty out. And that's what this picture shows. This is the distribution of productive assets. So you do see exactly the pattern you might have expected. Why is this important? First, because it offers a possibility of a big bang. A small intervention could have big effects on the lives of people. That, of course, is fundamental in a sense. That's fundamental. And, of course, it means that your social return on investment, the fact that if I give people money that has big consequences, people's lives, that's very good news, because you could give a little bit and get a lot for it. But also, what idea is bigger than the idea that the poorest of the poor have enough talent to be self-sufficient, that if you give them a push, they'll stay up? What idea is bigger than that? In a sense, in the realm of big ideas, this is an enormous idea, because it gives us faith in humanity. What could be bigger than that? And the reason why we did an RCT to do this is because we needed to follow people carefully over time to understand what's going on. And to do that, we would need to know who were the people who got the asset and people who went. The fact that an RCT gives you a lot of specificity, you can identify the people who should have got it and the people who didn't, and you can follow them over time, means that you can collect data to demonstrate something like this. Without an RCT, it would be much harder to demonstrate. Maybe you could do it, but it would be much harder to demonstrate that there was some dynamic pattern like this. The RCTs give you a very unique kind of data because you know who exactly to follow. And that's the power of that is what this exercise shows. Finally, let me talk the third and last claim or caricature I'll adopt is economics cumulatively builds a theory. RCTs are piecemeal. You do one thing here, one thing there. And I want to, obviously, you know by now my trick, which is to controvert this. And I'm going to go into this same story I was following and ask the question, I already told you there's a poverty trap, meaning people are poor because they're poor. Why are people poor because they're poor? What is the mechanism? What is making poor people poor? And what would liberate them from their poverty? So one possibility is technology. Maybe they're just, too poor to be able to use a good machine, and good machines are necessary to increase your income, and if you don't get the good machine, you'll never get there. The alternative is that it's psychology, that when I give you a boost in your wealth, you just feel liberated from the pressures of life, and that makes you perform. Now, both are entirely plausible, and the graduation program that I told you about, the BRACS program, does both. They give you an asset and they give you some psychological counseling. So it gives you both, and in a sense, both might be working there. So how do we know that both are important, or are both important? Well, are assets enough? So there's multiple RCTs where people were given lump sum cash transfers, so given cash and you at a bunch of cash, and then you see what happens. Some cases this had big positive effects, some cases it had no effect or no durable effect, and the answers were confusing. So one of the things that, so are these because these are different people with different aspirations, maybe they're different alternatives, or is it something more about the fact that these are really, if you give people cash, that's not enough, you need to do something else. So one of the things we did in Ghana in work with Dean Carlin, Hannah Truckman, and Chris Udry is we gave some people we gave the graduation program, some people we just gave the assets. And when you just give the assets and not the rest of it, not the hand-holding, you actually find that there is no durable effect. That suggests that the psychology might be important. Moreover, to look deeper into this question, is it psychology? What we did was we then took a next step in that experiment. Some of those people were given there was in the program, in the graduation program, there was some temporary cash support. So you got, before your asset becomes, paying, you got a little bit of extra cash to keep you going till your cow gives milk or you start selling. So we randomized how much that amount was. So we gave them either a small amount or a bigger amount. The idea was the bigger amount, maybe it's not, that just takes the pressure off them in the short run. Does that make them more productive? And to know whether we're more productive, we actually ran a bag factory. We produced 117,000 bags in the process. In that bag factory, we could see how productive people were. And first, people who got this graduation program were more productive, even though they had assets and therefore they were busier. They were actually more productive as well. They were working harder at both jobs. The second, if you give them high cash support, they were producing better bags at a faster speed. People just seemed to be much more enthusiastic about what they were doing, and as a result, they were much more productive. So, in a sense, what this says is that at least part of the effect here is the fact that being poor paralyzes people. They feel that there's too much pressure on them, and that pressure makes them less productive. And that's so. I want to say that both as a very important insight into why this economic model of that which said that if you give people money they'll become lazy. Well, maybe the economic pressure is off, but they're also more enthusiastic, and maybe that's why they're more productive. And in a sense, this is a long tradition of studying this in economics and not so much finding that, income makes people lazier, and maybe that's, the first RCT that we're aware of is the negative income tax experiment in New Jersey, and this already was finding that the people didn't seem to become lazier when they become richer. So going back to the question now, what did I learn from this that's general or big? I think first thing, RCTs are great for from the point of view actually of building up a theory. Unlike, I think, the claim that RCTs are about piecemeal, I think they're great precisely because they can be tailored to break up the theory into little pieces. So every piece in the story I was telling, I started by showing you that, when I give people assets, they become more productive, but then why do they become productive? So at each stage, we had a more nuanced hypothesis. First, it was, is it the case that, we do see evidence for a poverty trap? Do we see that S-shaped curve? That's a question we could ask. And then following on that, we could ask, is it enough to give them money, or is it, do we need to give them psychological counseling? And then after we thought maybe psychological counseling is important, we asked, is it the case that interventions that just make people more comfortable make them more productive? So all of these steps, in a sense, were important in getting to where we are, where we have some confidence in the idea that people feeling better about their own lives is important for their productivity. this is a process of the theory being tested piece by piece and built up into a narrative. And this is what's nice about an RCT, is that I can design the RCT to answer the specific piece I want to, the intervention I can choose to exactly test the theory I want to test. Something in the world we rarely can do, because in the world things don't actually vary in the way we control. The second, we do not have to do the tests, we don't need to necessarily make a lot of behavioral assumptions. We don't need to assume that people want money. We can test if people can want money, or whether they want something else. And the fact that we can test them means a lot of the theory is not tested based on other theories. They're tested based on simply observation or less theory, let's say. And that's also a great advantage of the RCT approach. Finally, you can set up a sequence of experiments in the same location to build up the theories. You can see if the same people treated in different ways give you different outcomes. And that dynamic process gives you a way to test theories bit by bit and build up a story. So in other words, so I will end by again thanking all of you. This is just a short list of the people whose papers I talked to you about in detail as we went. There are hundreds and hundreds of others who have simply completely transformed this area. They've taken the idea of our cities and ran wild in different directions, creating ideas that I think neither Michael nor Esther nor I ever thought of. And that's, I think, the most wonderful thing that's happening to us and to, I think, the field of development economics. And I say with genuine, I think, humility that I think that this is a prize at least as much for all of them as it is for us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Abhijit. So our next lecture will be given by Esther Duflo. She was born in Paris in the early 1970s, the daughter of a math professor and a pediatrician. So after high school, Esther went on to the École Normale Supérieure with the intention to specialize in history. So during a year in Moscow, she was supposed to work on her undergraduate essay, but she also worked as a research assistant to some famous economists who were there to advise the new Russian government. And having seen the power of economics to change policy, Esther returned to Paris, finished her ENS degree, turned to a master's in economics, and then went on to MIT for graduate school. Turned out MIT hired her as an assistant professor in 1999, directly after her PhD, and she has never joined another university after that. But Esther's whole career has been devoted to practical research on how best to alleviate poverty in its different shades and form. And in many ways, she has indeed followed that path that she saw in Moscow and become very successful in influencing policy, not the least by linking up many researchers to policymakers. So appropriately, today's lecture is entitled Field Experiments and the Practice of Policy. Please.
Good afternoon. The three of us have been repeating this is a prize for a movement. So at the risk of embarrassing people, I'm going to try and make that physically clear today. So I'm going to ask the people I'm calling by organization, not by name, to stand up so people in the room can see what a movement is. So let's start maybe by anybody who has ever worked for JPAL or IPA. Anybody who has ever worked for PAD? Stay up. The JPAL IPA people don't get to sit down. Jeff, you also represent USAID. Rachel, you also represent DFID. The Jamil family, the Weiss family. Any affiliates of JPAL? Anybody who has ever run an RCT and who happens not to be an affiliate of JPAL? And any graduate student who is doing development or thinking they might do development. So I'm going to start by clapping for these people. If I forget anybody, yell. But we believe this is a prize for a movement. A movement involves researchers, it involves staff, it involves money, it involves a partner. I forgot Pratham. Pratham, where is Pratham? They're not here. So think about Pratham. Any NGO partner, government partner, we can clap them anyways. And Amrita. Anybody who, it involves money, it involves partners, it involves thousands of boots on the ground, some of whom are rich today. So thank you very much for that. One of the really magnificent things about this prize is that I genuinely think people are truthful when everybody thinks it's a little bit for all of them. Even our old critics came back out of the woodwork to criticize again just to get a piece of the action, which has been kind of interesting. So I was not really meant to become an economist. As the daughter of a mathematician, I thought I would be an academic. My hero were Gauss or Leroy Ladurie. As the daughter of a physician, I kind of, and one who was spending time in developing countries, I wanted to be a change maker. That's a photo of me trying to accelerate my career as a change maker. That's in 1991 in Russia, not the year I lived there, 2 years before. I'm 18, and I'm trying to kind of crash into a revolution that is not really mine. I actually did a little bit of economics as an undergrad, but I really had no trust in economists. Like most people, actually. So this is a graph from much more recent, from 2017. It turns out that economists are some of the least trusted about their own field of expertise, just above politicians. And it doesn't ask, how much whether economists are trusted for dating advice or the trust in weather forecasters is about twice as big as the trust for economists. And I was very much there when I started economics as an undergraduate. I really, again, I wanted to be a change maker. I thought economics was just an elaborate hoax to justify the world exactly as it was by putting some not particularly interesting mathematics on it. And yet, 28 years later, I guess I'm here. I'm an economist. And to some extent, among all of the other people that we talked about, I have become something of a change maker. So this map represents the places not where we are conducting projects, but where JPAL has affected policy in any number of ways. So these are pretty much, there is one of these dots almost in all continents. There are various ways in which JPAL has influenced policies. The way we count it, when we first started, before we became JPAL, we were PAL, Poverty Action Lab. By the way, Rachel, as the first executive director of Poverty Action Lab, has to be credited for that magnificent name. And shortly after, we met Mohammed Jamil, and he was kind of challenging us to think, how many people you think you can affect? And we're like, what's a big number? And we said, okay, 100 million, that seems like a big number. We thought it was a bit of a crazy number, But yet, as of now, the way we count our influence in the world in the sense of the influence of the whole JPAL network, these 400 researchers who are associated with it, is that over 400 million people have been affected by policies which have been found to be effective by someone in the JPAL network. That's without counting all of the people who have not been affected by policies which are found to be ineffective by the JPAL network, which is probably also an important number, but a little bit harder to track. So what I want to talk about today is how that change happens. So let me start a little bit like Abhijit by the Strowman. So the Strowman is that you run a small, well-designed experiment, very controlled with very excellent partners, maybe 100 school, 50 treatment, 50 control, really tightly monitor what is going on the ground, get some effects, so that's your results. Then you prepare a shiny policy brief, and then you peddle it to policymakers, and then they adopt, and there is full-scale adoption. So that's kind of the Strowman. Maybe to some extent it's a bit more than a Strowman in the sense it might have been the model that at some point, at least I personally thought would be kind of the model we would follow. But it turns out that it's not the model. So let me first start by saying what are various criticisms that people have expressed to this model. Well, if you run small experiments, they are gold-plated, so when you go at larger scale, you won't have the same effect. Also, if you run an experiment somewhere, the result will be valid for this one place, but how do you know that they will be valid elsewhere? And in any case, all experiments have some issues, so are you sure that you really have a perfect solution? And then when you prepare your policy brief, even if we could believe your results, the policymakers, are they going to be interested? It really depends on what they are doing, and nobody is going to pay much attention anyways. And if they did, when they're actually going to implement the project for all of the reasons above, plus the fact that when something is scaled up, stuff happens, the effects are not going to be what you expect. There is going to be effects that are going to be different in equilibrium, there is going to be some political economy reaction, and so on and so forth. So really, the idea that you can go from a small experiment to widespread adoption is a myth. And well, maybe, but it turns out that it is really not the way that it works. You don't just do your small experiment, write your policy brief, and go away. It is not at all the way that the policy influence, the policy dialogue, I would say, has taken place. Let me give you some example of various ways in which this is quite different. So the first one I want to start with is microcredit, because in a way microcredit would be the closest model of this, in the sense that the impacts that were found have had an influence on their own without even direct follow-through with governments or with organizations. But even there, as I'll describe in a minute, the process is much more elaborate than just doing an experiment, getting the results, diffusing them. So in the 2000s, as you might well remember, in Scandinavian countries, microcredit was all the rage. It was all the rage in the media. Of course, Mohamed Yunus received the Nobel Prize in 2006. And the idea that it had such a large scale, today it reached about 200 million people, that it had the possibility to change the world. If it was effective, it would have massive effect. And there was a lot of anecdotes that it could help. You had a lot of success stories, etc., but very little hard evidence on whether it had any effect on poverty. And then the tone shifted somewhere actually shortly after the Nobel Prize, which I hope is not a harbinger of things to come for us. And you started hearing like bad stories, mostly from the media, mostly anecdotes of people trapped in microdebt, of farmer suicide, of people who were kind of under too much debt from microcredit, etc. And we still had no, really, on either side, no evidence to say either ways. And all this time, several of us had been quite desperate. Dean here and Abhijit and I and others had been desperate to find a partner to do an evaluation of microcredit. But while the going were good, there was not too much enthusiasm for an impact evaluation for microcredit. And finally, we started to get some traction. And the first two projects were in the Philippines and in India. In the Philippines, the effects were kind of okay. In India, they were kind of not great. But when we got the India results, we were actually very wary of diffusing them. Because the first evaluation we had done, Rachel and Abhijit and me were involved, and Annie was actually running around trying to get it off the ground. This was in Hyderabad, which is the hotbed of microcredit in India, saturated with other forms of access to credit. So we felt, well, maybe that's why it could be that it's why it's not that effective, because there is so many other alternatives that people have. So we kind of sat and waited and didn't do much with this result, certainly in terms of diffusing them, because we didn't think we had enough to go on for anybody to draw a conclusion. And then progressively studies started to accumulate, and finally we could put them all together and publish them together with the same format and the same template, which allowed to analyze them together, which is some work that Rachel Meager, who was at the time a PhD student at MIT, did, which is to say, let's look at all the countries where we did microcredit evaluation. We can look at the results individually, those are the blue chart, or we can try to combine them together with some statistical modeling and say what they tell us together, and in particular, do they want to tell us all the same story, or are they going all over the place? And what you can see from the red the red bars is that they want to all tell us the same story, which is not much happening in terms of profit anyways. And if we look at average effects on various things, really not much happening either way for the average person, which on the one hand means no one is really hot, but on the other hand means the average person doesn't get out of poverty because of microcredit. Another thing we found, though, from this series of studies, that if you look at people who already had a business before microcredit started, then those people actually benefit from microcredit. And in fact, we've continued to follow them over time, and we see that they start benefiting a lot 10 years later. So it's not that there is no effect on anybody, but the effects are heterogeneous, and the average effects are quite mediocre. So that led to sort of a changing in the debate from this is a disaster versus this is a miracle to, and that's quite remarkable for the media, a relative kind of neutral tone. Small is smart, a partial marvel is probably the best title, but then it's The Economist, they are good at titles, or small chance. So that changed the policy debate. It actually changed also the view of many microfinance organizations, and of course eventually changed microfinance, because we were not against microfinance. In fact, a lot of us really want microfinance to succeed. What this result suggested is that the product that were evaluated, which is this one-size-fits-all type of product, really is not ideal, probably, because on the one hand, there is heterogeneity. Some people need something else. Some people really need consumption finance. Some people need business lending with more flexible loan, etc. So the second wave of experiments on microfinance was very much about experimenting on the terms of microfinance, finding out, for example, whether people would do better if they had a grace period of a month before starting to repay, seeing whether the group structure, which is very rigid, was really that necessary, trying to find ways to identify the most entrepreneurial of the possible clients and lend to them, and so on and so forth. So that this set of work doesn't lead to a one yes, no microfinance, thumbs up, thumbs down, but how do you make microfinance into an effective product for the relevant segment of the population? Let me give you a second example, which is an example where it was more than producing the results and then a new wave of working together, but it was going from this time a positive result all the way to policy impact at scale, and try to give you a little bit of a sense of how that takes place and how that's far of cry from just getting the results and moving out. And that's the example of teaching at the right level. So in many developing countries, a key feature is that many kids are in school, but most of them are not learning very much. So this is a picture for India, where you can see that a little under half of the kids can read at standard 2 level when they reach standard 5. The performance is even worse in mathematics, where it's closer to 25%. So of course it's a huge waste, and a bunch of experiments have taken place which can help us see whether it's because they don't have inputs. In fact, Michael's very first project was on textbooks. So is it a lack of inputs? Is it because teachers are underpaid? Is it because they are not willing? Is it because parents are lazy, and so on and so forth? And cutting a long story short, it's really none of that. What it really seems to be, in a large part, is that the pedagogy is inappropriate to most of the kids. In fact, most of the developing countries which are former colonies still have this very elitist curriculum, which are coming to some extent from the fact that originally the systems were set up to educate a small elite that was going to be helping the colonial power. And then at independence, the system was just expanded as is, because it's politically very difficult to somehow scale down, because it's a little bit like if you were shortchanging the children. But the result is that kids are taught not at all at the level where they can learn, but at some aspirational level, which is way far what most of them can comprehend. So then the solution seems deceptively simple, is to teach them at the right level. Now one could think the ideal thing would be to do it through the curriculum, but as I said, this is not really a popular move. So we started working, in fact it was my first RCT, started working with Pratham. And this is Rukmini Banerjee and Madhav Chavan, the first people from Pratham we work with, the first and the second leader of the organization. And the idea of Pratham is very simple. You have to teach to the kids you have in front of you. So what they have is to rearrange, the way the programs works today is to rearrange the kids by level all the time, by achievement level in a frequent way, and then target the activities to where the kids are. And we started evaluating this project. The first version of the project was a remedial education program that we evaluated with Sean some time back. Then we looked at it in more rural areas, and then we started getting interested in whether teachers could implement this approach, and this was done in summer camps, and they could do it, and in all of those cases the results were positive. One shortcoming of doing the project on a volunteer basis is that you don't have all the children that you would like to have, because they don't necessarily come. So it seems like a waste that they are in school all this time and not being taught at the right level, and it seems that it would be more efficient if the teachers could teach at the right level. So Pratham got very interested in scaling it up via the education system, which of course makes a lot of sense, and they started to get some traction in doing this work. And when they got some traction doing this work, we could evaluate their work by carving down some villages to do, if you want, the reverse of a randomized control trial, where what we have is we carve out a control group in an environment where most of the schools have the program being tested. So we can test this kind of scaled-up version by carving out a control group from an otherwise sea of treated areas. And what we found there when we did it the first time is that although the teachers had been quite excited to be trained, when they came back to the schools, they didn't implement the program. And as we had this program going on, we had a qualitative work done by Indian organization, and interviewing people up and down the hierarchy. And what came out of it is that the teachers think it's nice, but they don't have time time to do these activities because they have to complete the curriculum, which, by the way, they have to do by law. So you cannot blame them to want to complete the curriculum because it happens to be their job. And of course, this also happens to be their job because this had been scaled up within the government, but it had not been really conveyed. So in the presence of these different tensions between their activities, they decided to stay safe and continue teaching the curriculum. So then if the answer was, and that's something where we had the complete, we kept talking to Pratham, discussing with them, they are ahead of the game most of the time on us, but this having the study helped in figuring out that there was a problem to solve. The answer was like, you either need to carve out a time in the year, so doing it in short bursts of camps, or you have to carve out a time in the day, say an hour per day, and you have to make it very clear that it is their job by involving the hierarchy, by involving their bosses. So the new versions of the program either worked in short bursts of activities, or with teacher, or with during the regular school days, but in a dedicated time with training of the teacher supervisors, who were then able to kind of relay the program, both help but also remind them that yes, this is in fact part of your job, and you are not to convert the hour into something else because you want to complete your curriculum. In the meantime, there had been some tests of the same program in Ghana. Annie was leading a team of Ghanaians to India, lost some of them along the way, so that's part of the danger of doing policy making when you lose your higher official of the Ghana education team in the middle of India, but they got found. And thanks to that, the whole thing didn't get stuck. And then these two models that I talked about, the camps and the teacher-led model, happened, and both of these showed positive effects. And if you know, this is a long way in coming in having a program that actually has a lot of staying power, can actually be scaled up. And now this program is being scaled up. So these are some of the co-conspirators in this work. Now this program actually is being scaled up, not only in India in a large way where it reached several million children, but with support from Co-Impact in many countries in Africa right now. So this is to give you a sense of how the project of going from a nice proof of concept to an actual scalable program goes on. What should have been clear here is that the process of working together to develop a project that can be implemented at scale is not something that academics do sort of in isolation of the organization or as the giving advice and being somewhat superior to the organization or whatever. It's really a project of co-creation. And that project of co-creation is now very much going on as well, directly with governments, where a lot of the work that many affiliates of JPAL and IPA and others who run RCT do is now to work directly with governments, to help them do what they would like to do anyways. So in some cases I've called this addressing the plumbing problems, in the sense that it's not about, should I invest in health or in education, but it's about, I have this, say, rice distribution program that is currently going on, and there are issues with it. What can we try to make it work better? And so the example of that is that I'm going to give today is a work by many people whose photos you're going to see in a minute. And it's concerns the rice distribution project in Indonesia. The rice distribution program is a massive redistribution program which is funded centrally but administered locally, and has an extremely large budget and has, as many programs, a lot of issues. In particular, it has the problems that the poor receive only 30% of the subsidies that is intended, and pay in general more than what they should be paying for, about 25% more. And the reason the government failed was in part that they are not properly informed that the program is going. So Ben Olken and Rima Anna, who have been working in Indonesia for many years, have a very long-running, standing relationship with the government, and there is often a back and forth between possible project and possible policy ideas, where the government comes up with them for questions. And here the question was, what about if we distributed a card that made people aware that they are eligible for this program? And they said, well, why not? So this is now the full team: Abhijit, Rima, Jordan, Kyle, Ben Olken, and Sudarno. What did they do? What did they say? They said, well, great, we can set up an experiment. In fact, we can do it on quite a large scale because this program is everywhere and distributing cards is not particularly expensive. But as long as we are going to set up an experiment, why don't we try not only whether distributing cards would be effective, but also what would be the ideal ways to distribute the cards. So why don't we vary, for example, the information that's on the card? Would it be important for people to know what's the price at which they are eligible for the card, or would it not really matter? So you can see the difference in the cards. Would it matter if everybody who is eligible gets the card, or just a few in the village so people know the program exists? Would it matter if we plastered the village with posters such that not only the eligible people know that they are eligible, but the officials know that they know, and the people know that the official know that they know, and so on and so forth, such that it changes the way in which people bargain? Would it be important if the cards also had some clip-and coupons that the official would be supposed to give up upstairs to create also the impression that there is accountability in the program? So not only they tried the cards, but they tried all these versions of the cards. And when they did that, they found not only the effect of the cards, but also the best version of the card. The best version of the card is to have the common knowledge and to put the price in and to give it to as many people as possible, and the accountability is not that important. And that version of the cards increased the take-up of the program a lot. Overall, distributing cards increased the take-up of the program, increased the subsidies that people get, which is a combination of the take-up and the price paid, by 26%, driven by a reduction in leakage. So obviously it's very cost-effective because it's not very expensive to distribute cards, and therefore it's something that the government scaled up almost immediately after they were finished with the program. So here you can see an immediate scale-up following the research project, but that's because the research project is part of the government functioning itself. And there are several examples like that. I just wanted to give you one more, because it's one which involves, again, a quite focused process of really thinking through an economic problem together with the government partner, combining a good knowledge or a decent knowledge, let's say, of economics with excellent knowledge, I would say, of the institution on the ground. And that's the reforming the auditing of farms in Gujarat. That also is, I think, an important project in terms of its themes, because it's about pollution and reducing pollution and curbing climate change is one of the big challenges we'll have to solve in the years to come. So Gujarat is actually has been kind of on the forefront of trying to do something about their pollution problem. It's actually one of the most polluted places in India, one of the fastest industrial production state in terms of industrial production, and therefore in terms of industrial pollution. A few years ago, the court forced them to create a third-party audit system, which is one system where each firm has to hire an independent auditor to give them an audit every year, a clean bill of health in terms of environment. So that sounds great in many ways, because you have people with competence that come in that might not exist within the government, but it's not great in a pretty key way, which is it creates a conflict of interest between the auditor and the firm, because the firm pays the auditor, the auditor has all of the incentive to give the firm exactly what they want, which is a clean bill of health regardless. So we, to find that if it was really an issue, so we were discussing with the government, they really had a sense that this was a problem and that the audit system was almost defect. And that's actually why we got in touch with them. But to, test it, we compared the result from the audit firm. So these are the audit report. And you can see that most of the firms are right below the threshold in terms of this particular pollutant, SPM. So either that means that the firms are really competent at targeting their pollution level, or that means that the auditors are making up the data to be exactly in the right place. And of course, the latter is correct in this case, because once you back-check those firms, you find that the true pollution of the firm is all over the place compared to the audit. So the back-checks are performed a few days after, and you can see how the pollution actually distributes, with many firms polluting much more, some firms polluting even much less. That means not only they are making up the data, but they're not even taking the trouble of going to the farm. But that said, if you're going to make up the data, why spend the cost of actually collecting it? So what we proposed, that's Michael Greenstone, Roy Pandenic, and myself, what we proposed is to say, look, the problem is really the conflict of interest. There is the loyalty of the auditing firm is to the polluting firm, it's not to society. So you have to break that down. So instead of having the firm hire the auditing firm, create a pool which is going to be used to pay the auditors, number one, then randomly assign the auditors to the firm to be monitored every day, and then pay them based on their accuracy. So once we did that, we had a much more accurate treatment. This is now the treatment and the back check, and you can see that the audit in the treatment look very much like the back check. So basically almost all of the lying of the auditors got removed by simply having this in place. So that's an example where we were kind of working with them, bringing our economics, bringing our knowledge of the institution to do something together. Here again, they adopted it for all of Gujarat. So the Supreme Court approved it as a way of implementing the scheme, and this is now what is done in Gujarat. More generally, these examples and many other like that are an example of what we are trying to do, which is try to, in a sense, slowly, little by little, making ourselves irrelevant by fostering a culture of learning, both within the government and within all of the institutions that support them. So many governments have launched units that do a randomized control trial on their own, like the Minelu Lab in Peru. We have long-standing partnership with government, for example, a Tamil Nadu research partnership. And the hope is that one day, in a sense, we can make ourselves irrelevant, and that would be kind of the culmination of the process if the culture of learning had developed so much that it would take place by many actors in many different ways. Thank you very much.